And I wanted to start there actually with our questions and ask you about the misrepresentation of the Black body politic, which is itself a kind of racist notion that essentializes a group of people and their political aims on the spurious base of race. It flattens different interests between and within the Black populations of the US, between classes. So, who are the champions of this notion of Black politics, and what do they stand to gain from that?
Yeah, I'll try to get the ball rolling. Like I was going to say that actually, Touré has been sharper and more eloquent on this point than I have. But it's, well, look, here's the opener, and this is a line I'm taking from him. That the size of the Black American population is just about identical to the size of the Canadian population. So if we pause and think for a second, well, Canadians believe X and Canadians want X. We might have a sense of how preposterous such a notion is, depending on the stereotypes that people walk around with about Canadians. I mean, I think they're gentle, for instance. So that should tell you that there's some ideology at work here, right? And with this notion of the Black body politic, and that again, like when at the beginning of the Sanders second campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, I remember talking to Touré, and I think he actually talked to a friend of ours who had a voice in the campaign, to make the point that this notion that Bernie had to appeal to something called the Black vote was a terrible mistake, because the Black vote is indeed an ideological class skewed construction that doesn't connect with the interests and concerns of the masses of working Black Americans. But it's a tough pill. Or rather, it's a tough drug for people to stop taking, right? Because it's so familiar. And one of the reasons that it's familiar is that it's been part of the notion of what a Black leader is since the notion of a Black leader first came into existence, which can roughly be dated from September 18th, 1895, when Booker T. Washington gave that speech at the Atlanta Cotton States Exposition Address, where he was auditioning for the role of Negro leader. So when you think about all of the generations now that have come together around questions like, well, what does the Negro want? What does the Black man want? Even what does the African American community want? It's a tough habit for people to break, but just because it's a tough habit for people to break doesn't make it any less wrong-headed, or I don't know, what's the word, racist, right? Because it is fundamentally a racist perspective on this large, diverse population. I'm done.
Well, okay. Well, when you started, I was reflecting on Booker T. Washington. So it's funny that you went there, and I was going to go a slightly different way, but overlapping. And this relates to an aspect of the question, which was who benefits from it, and from the notion of Black politics and, of course, a Black leadership class. And in keeping with my father's point and his reference to Washington, it's certainly complicated who benefits from it, but often enough, if we take this back to, I guess our favorite whipping boy, Booker T. Washington, you can kind of see that the beneficiaries are often enough class skewed. That Washington, Booker T. Washington, who I think we all know and hopefully don't all love, is known as, among other things, the principal of Tuskegee Institute, right? And having been a former slave born into slavery, and of course arising from the shackles of bondage to being the Negro leader by 1895. And one of the things that's sort of interesting about Washington, and someone who's involved in this exchange had likened President Obama to Washington, and I'll let that person elaborate on this if he is so inclined. But one of the things that's sort of interesting about Washington is, of course, while in mythology, we think of Washington as this great sort of individual uplift story, right? And of course, he couldn't have had Tuskegee Institute. It wouldn't have been possible to fund Tuskegee Institute had he not had the backing of a Northern philanthropist class and the enlightened nascent business class in the South who were looking to accommodate Blacks to second-class citizenship, right? Who were engaged in a project intended to, for all intent and purpose, nullify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And I should say, for all intent and purpose, to nullify the 13th. Unambiguously, I would say to nullify the 14th and 15th Amendments. And their project was the exploitation of the Black masses on some level. And of course, not just the Black masses, we should also acknowledge the sharecropper, the growing white sharecropper class as well, right? I mean, because their end game was to secure, as close as possible, rightsless laborers who were primed for exploitation. The principal beneficiary, well, I learned in Black History Month a long time ago in the 70s that Booker T. Washington was a great Black leader. And that was a tough pill to swallow when I came home once again and got the smack back, if you will, from my father when I came home with this great pearl of wisdom. But while many of us learned in Black History Month over the last so many decades that Washington was a great Black leader, and it's true. He was a great Black leader insofar as he was the most influential Black leader in American life from 1895 to about 1915. He was because white people said so, right? And it's not all white people. It's the white ruling class, if you will, which is maybe a bit reductive, but a stratum of the white ruling class funded him with the end game of the exploitation of the Black masses. It's kind of hard to take pride. One could take pride, I suppose, in that project. But I think if one looks at Black politics through the lens of great leaders without considering who are charged with the responsibility of representing the Negro race, without considering what that project actually can mean, then that leaves one vulnerable to charlatans. And of course, individuals who, if charlatan is a bit too opaque, individuals who certainly represent Black people insofar as they check off the box that indicates that they're Black, right, or look the part in some way. But if their power base doesn't come from Black Americans, then they represent some other constituency. Since 1964, we could say, the class stratification in Black America has become, more intense, right? I mean, that the class cleavages among Blacks have sharpened. And while I think it was clear that there was class stratification in Washington's day, there was class stratification during the Great Migration among Blacks, there's class stratification from the New Deal through World War II. With the victories of the modern civil rights movement, class stratification among Blacks has become more significant. And it is, I would say, much more difficult to make a compelling case that Blacks share a unitary interest today. But to just tie this up, if you insist that they do, then that sets us up again for empowering individuals who represent a constituency who happens to be Black. But in all probability, what those individuals would represent is a kind of class politics, the class politics that is owed to their connections within the capital D Democratic Party or among white elites.
So I want to pause on 1964, which you mentioned, because that comes up in your Socialist Register piece. This is, of course, the year that Lyndon Johnson signs into law both the Economic Opportunity Act, which, of course, inaugurates the War on Poverty, and then, of course, the Civil Rights Act. So one thing I found really interesting in your piece is that you argue that both of these landmark bills are really significant for kind of reshaping the trajectory of Black politics in the US. So maybe Touré, if you could start by kind of giving us some of the historical context leading up to the passage of these bills. Why did these bills make it through? Whereas, for example, the freedom budget kind of fell by the wayside. And then maybe Adolph, after that, you could pick up on, talking about how these bills sort of ended up changing the fight for racial equality in the US.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is obviously a really important piece of legislation. I mean, I think is transparently critical of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as my father and I are. I think our criticisms come down to the fact that it was incapable of addressing the large spectrum of problems that African Americans faced in that time period. I think we are both quite pleased with certain elements of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We're both, I think we like Title VII with caveat, right? And Title VII, of course, is something that we talk about in this piece. And of course, we think it's appropriate to prevent employers from discriminating against, for businesses discriminating against folks in the public sphere, right? Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of good things that come out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but among the problems with the 1964 Act that we explore is that it was not capable of addressing the problems that, let's say, the organizers of the 1963 March on Washington, who would go on to put together the Freedom Budget for All, had pointed to, which was that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 addressed the problem of discrimination, but it did not address the problems that were the political economic problems that were impacting Blacks disproportionately in the form of automation. And you could say the legacy costs of redlining, right, where Blacks were confronted, or were rather the disproportionate victims of deindustrialization at that stage of the game as cities function had begun to transform with the assistance of the Highway Act. And so you have corporate flight, first from central cities to the suburbs, and then right to work states, and then ultimately, the far-flung corners of the globe, all in pursuit of cheaper and cheaper labor. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, as important as it was, wasn't really about addressing those issues. And again, it addressed narrowly workplace discrimination, and in this case, by way of Title VII, which could not then provide assistance to Blacks in coping with those other political economic developments. The Economic Opportunity Act is kind of cut from the same cloth. I mean, they're all part of an inadequate war on poverty on some level, which certainly perceived that there were other problems afoot, but too much of the Economic Opportunity Act, I think, centered less on the disproportionate impacts of automation and deindustrialization on Blacks, and more on problems like the soft and hard skill sets deficits that Blacks and other workers who were overrepresented among poor people faced. And in both instances, what you have is, through the Johnson administration following through on the limitations of the Kennedy administration before it, a failure to address the structural transformation of the U.S. economy that was already underway demonstrably by the mid-1950s, right? I mean, this is the fact that there is a decline in the number of entry-level, good-paying unionized jobs that you can trace back to, I think, about 1953, which meant that the avenues for upward mobility that whites had taken from the tenements to the suburbs beginning, during the Second World War, had already begun to narrow after the Korean War had ended. The fact of the matter is that, the Johnson administration sidestepped, for all intent and purpose, efforts that might have addressed the disproportionate impact of the structural transformation of the U.S. economy from a blue-collar manufacturing economy to one that was moving more and more rapidly toward service and high-tech economy.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, I would just add that that the 50s moment is really important, and people don't think about that very much. And I guess, this is one of the problems, though, like, with this kind of historical analysis, you can wind up, it's like unraveling a woolen threader or a sweater, rather. But the big defeat, I think, that we suffered, that progressive left of center forces suffered, was already like in the late 40s. The defeat that took the form of the defeat of the Real Full Employment Bill in 1945, the defeat of the Murray-Dingell-Wagner Act, which would have expanded a Social Security program to give us national health insurance, among other things, and then, of course, the passage of Taft-Hartley. So for that period, and Samir Santi's work on this is really great. From the end of the Korean War until end of the Kennedy administration, we acted out class struggle through a kind of Aesopian debate between, the norm of full employment versus the norm of currency stability, right, and control of inflation. And that became more and more prominent as a way of understanding the poles in national political discourse until the Kennedy administration came down squarely in favor of currency stability as the main concern. So why am I going off about that? Well, because what happened then was that in this context, it's in the late 50s that poverty gets discovered, or I would argue invented, as a way of understanding economic inequality, right? And it's a way that's fundamentally disconnected from political economy, right? And if you reconstruct the discourse about poverty, even coming from people with left credentials like Michael Harrington, it's much more culturalist discourse, all right? And then that sets us up then for the confrontation within the Kennedy and Johnson administrations between one element that was centered in the labor movement and the Labor Department, and the other element that was centered in the Ford Foundation, basically. So I've already said what side I'm on, haven't I? But where the latter tendency insisted that people were poor not because of stuff going on with the economy, right? The Labor Secretary Willard Wirtz just said, well, look, people are poor because they don't have jobs to pay them enough money. So what we need to do to fight poverty is have a federal jobs program. The smart guys from the Ford Foundation thought, no, like they're poor because they don't have a good sense of personal esteem. What we need to do is develop programs that will build a sense of social efficacy. And then somehow that would magically convert into people being able to get out of poverty. It also coincidentally provided one substantive response to rising Black American demands for political incorporation, and the War on Poverty programs became a significant mechanism for boosting Black political incorporation, and not just in the South. It's quite important in the South, in places like in New Orleans and Atlanta. War on poverty spending helped to advance a thaw in old school race relations that sort of fueled a kind of business-led or business-friendly approach to desegregation, but also in cities outside the South, right? This was like the combination of the War on Poverty and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then especially the Voting Rights Act the following year, created the material conditions for the emergence and consolidation of a Black political class, right, or a class of Black political functionaries, and that's what became the foundation for what has been understood as Black politics ever since then.
The invention.
So in that sense, I was going to say, in that sense, like it's always been a sharply class-skewed affair.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.